I'm going to be addressing some fairly controversial subjects tonight in terms of recognizing pain in ridden horses. I was quite stunned by the results of the poll, and I think the audience will understand why when I present the background to why we developed the ridden horse pain ethogram. So, first of all, let's ask the question, what is an ethogram? An ethogram is a series of behaviors with specific definitions. For example, as we see in the horse on the right, the ears back behind a vertical position for 5 seconds or more. Repeated exposure of the sclera, the white of the eye. The mouth being open with separation of the teeth for 10 seconds or more. And the tongue being out or moving in and out repeatedly. So why was the ridden horse pain ethogram developed? There were a number of reasons. Lameness may not be apparent in hand or on the lunge, but only evident ridden. And lameness may be manifest as a change in performance rather than overt lameness. I believe that recognition of aspects of behavior can highlight the likely presence of pain, but I also believe from evidence that owners, and also I'm sad to say some veterinarians, are not very good at recognizing the presence of lameness. In a study of 57 sports horses, which were in normal work, and these were professionally produced dressage and show jumping horses, assumed to be non-lame, 47% showed lameness either in hand, on the lunge, or ridden, and 12% of these were only lame when ridden. In a more recent study, based in the United Kingdom, we had a convenient sample of 148 amateur and professionally owned horses believed by their owners to be working comfortably. These horses were assessed in hand and ridden. 28% were lame in hand and 62% were lame when ridden. The difference in lameness when ridden versus in hand was statistically significantly different. However, the presence or absence of lameness in hand versus ridden was somewhat unpredictable. 13 horses were lame in hand, but not when ridden, whereas 63 horses were lame when ridden, but not when assessed in hand. When evaluated ridden, the horses were assessed in both walk, trot, and canter. 60% of the horses showed gait abnormalities in canter, such as lack of a suspension phase or close spatial and temporal separation of the hind limbs. I have been very conscious for many years during my clinical work that owners were poor at recognizing the signs of lameness. And many ridden horse problems were attributed to training or the rider, or that's just a difficult horse. I had also observed during my lameness investigations that many behaviors that I saw in ridden horses disappeared when I removed the lameness using nerve blocks. I therefore felt that there was a strong relationship between ridden horse behavior and the presence of musculoskeletal pain. I was aware that owners were clearly bad at recognizing lameness, and therefore it might be helpful if we could demonstrate scientifically that behavior could be related to pain, and maybe owners could be better at recognizing behavior. And therefore, we set about the development of an ethogram to determine the presence or absence of pain in the ridden horse. And we did this initially by comparing a large number of video recordings of lame and non-lame horses. and we started with 117 behavioural features. We then compared the presence or absence of these behavioural features in 13 non-lame horses and 24 lame horses. And by this comparison, we were able to determine which of these 117 behaviours were most commonly associated with pain. We identified 24 behaviours, the majority of which were 10 times more likely or more to be seen in a lame horse compared with a non-lame horse. And these 24 behaviours I'm going to describe to you. The first being the ears rotated back behind a vertical position for 5 seconds or more. The eyelids being closed or half closed for between 2 and 5 seconds. The sclera, or the white of the eye, being exposed on a repeated basis. The horse exhibiting an intense stare or glazed expression for 5 seconds or more. The mouth being open or opening and shutting repeatedly with separation of the teeth for at least 10 seconds. The tongue being exposed, either protruding or hanging out, or moving in and out on a repeated basis. The bit being pulled through the mouth on one side, either to the left or to the right, reflecting uneven rein tension. There were body markers. These included repeated up and down changes of head position, not in rhythm with the trot, or the head being tilted on a repeated basis. The front of the head being in front of the vertical position, more than 30 degrees for at least 10 seconds, or the head being behind the vertical position, more than 10 degrees for at least 10 seconds. The head position being changed on an intermittent or regular basis from side to side. The tail either being clamped tightly to the horse's buttocks or held crookedly to one side. And repeated tail swishing movements, either up and down, side to side, or in circular movements, either during walk, trot, or canter, or during transitions. And then there were gait markers. A rushed gait being defined as a frequency of trot steps of more than 40 per 15 seconds, or an irregular rhythm in trot or canter, repeated changes of speed in trot or canter, or the gait being too slow with a frequency of trot steps less than 35 per 15 seconds, this often appearing as a passage-like trot. The hind limbs not following the tracks of the forelimbs, but deviating either to the left or to the right. Therefore, the horse moving on 3 tracks, as we see in the image on the right, when the left hind limb is being placed on an inner track compared to the left forelimb. The horse repeatedly striking off on the wrong leg, or repeatedly changing legs either in front or behind, becoming disunited. Or the horse showing spontaneous changes of gait, for example, breaking from canter to trot or from trot to canter. The final 5 behaviours were the horse either stumbling in front or behind, or exhibiting a repeated bilateral hind limb toe drag. The horse spontaneously changing in direction against the rider's cues or directions, or spooking. The horse being reluctant to move forwards freely, having to be either kicked or verbally encouraged or stopping spontaneously, and the horse either rearing or bucking, as we see in the image on the right. When we compared lame and non-lame horses, we found a significant difference in the ridden horse behavior ethogram scores. The non-lame horses had a maximum occurrence of 6 of the 24 behaviors, and the most frequent score and the average score were 2 out of 24. Whereas the lame horses had a maximum occurrence score of 14 of the 24 behaviors, with the most frequent and the average scores being 9 out of 24. So here we see on the left, the horse swishing its tail, in the middle, the horse tilting its head and the right ear being back, and on the far right, both ears being back, the horse having an intense stare or glazed expression, and the bit being pulled through to the left and the mouth open. I can't tell from this photograph if the teeth are separated. The presence of 8 or more behavioral markers were likely to reflect the presence of musculoskeletal pain, although a small number of lame horses scored less than 8. In this graph, we have the ridden horse pain ethogram score on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, to the left, we have the lame horses, and to the right, we have the sound horses. The dark blue boxes reflect the total score, the green boxes reflect the facial scores, the brown boxes represent the body scores, and the white boxes represent the gait scores. And we can see all of the scores are higher for the lame horses compared with the non-lame horses. And most specifically, the lame horses mostly had a score of more than 8. The blue hashed line represents that cutoff of 8, whereas the majority of the non-lame horses scored substantially less than 8. We then went on to compare a group of horses which were lame horses before and after resolution of lameness by the use of nerve blocks. And we observed that there was a significant reduction in the ridden horse pain ethogram scores after the resolution of lameness. So in the pictures on the right, we can see the horse before diagnostic analgesia with the rider in the pink t-shirt. The ears are back. The horse has an intense stare. Its tail is swishing. Whereas on the far right, with the rider now in the blue sweater, the ears are forward. The front of the head is in a vertical position, whereas previously it had been in front of the vertical, and the horse has got a more open expression in its eye, and the tail is swinging nicely. This second study provided further evidence that the presence of 8 or more behaviors was likely to reflect the presence of musculoskeletal pain. In a further study, we evaluated the ability of 10 non-trained individuals of various professional backgrounds to utilize the ethogram and compare their performance with an expert, viewing the videos of 21 horses before and after diagnostic analgesia to eliminate their lameness. And this study showed that the non-trained assessors were able to differentiate between the horses before and after diagnostic analgesia. Our next question was, can veterinarians reliably apply the whole horse ridden ethogram to differentiate between non-lame and lame horses based on live horse assessment of behavior? We had 10 volunteer veterinarians who underwent preliminary training. They then observed 20 volunteer horse rider combinations performing a purpose-designed dressage type test of 8.5 minutes duration. The trained veterinarians were able, based on use of the ridden horse pain ethogram alone, to differentiate between those horses which were lame and those horses which were non-lame. Of the 20 horse rider combinations, which were assumed to be non-lame horses, 4 alone were non-lame horses. 16 of the horses showed either low-grade lameness or gait abnormalities in canter. We also were able to assess the ability of the trained assessor, the expert, to compare their performance using real-time assessment of horses versus application of the ethogram to video recordings. And here we have a summary of the results. The ridden horse pain ethogram score is on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we have the expert's assessment in real time on the left, the expert's assessment of the video recordings in the middle, and the trained veterinarians on the right-hand side. The green boxes represent the lame horses, and the blue boxes represent the non-lame horses. And we can see there's a good similarity in the scores of the expert for both the real-time and the video assessments, and between the expert and the volunteer veterinarians. And this applies both to the lame horses and to the non-lame horses. For the non-lame horses, the trained veterinarian scores were slightly higher than the experts. And for the lame horses, there was slightly greater variability for the volunteer veterinarian scores versus the experts. But basically, there was very good agreement. We then went on to apply the ridden horse pain ethogram to horses out in the field. So we had a convenient sample of 60 sports horses and riding school horses in regular work, and once again assumed by their owners to be working comfortably. They performed the same 8.5 minutes duration dressage type test at preliminary level, plus the addition of 10-meter diameter circles to the left and to the right in rising trot. Of these 60 horses, 73% of the horses were lame. However, that lameness was of a relatively low grade, being grade 2 out of 8 maximum on 1 or more limbs. 47% of these 60 horses had gait abnormalities in canter. The ridden horse pain ethogram scores ranged between 3 and 16 out of 24, with a median, or the most common score, being 9. And there was a statistically positive association between the ridden horse pain ethogram scores and the presence of lameness. So the higher the ridden horse pain ethogram scores, the more likely it was that the horses were lame horses or had gait abnormalities in canter. So these series of studies indicate to me that the ridden horse pain ethogram is a potentially very powerful tool to differentiate between horses experiencing musculoskeletal pain when ridden and those which are pain-free. So the presence of 8 or more behaviors is highly likely to reflect the presence of musculoskeletal pain. However, some lame horses score less than 8 behaviors, and that may be because the lameness is very mild or they're particularly stoical individuals. So how do we use the ridden horse pain ethogram? I think it is useful to provide owner education of the presence or the absence of a problem, despite the fact that owners are often unable to recognize lameness. By looking at behavior you should be able to identify that your horse may have a pain-related problem. It helps us to identify the presence of a problem that may be subclinical, but still contributing to poor performance. By early recognition of the presence of musculoskeletal pain and investigation of that problem, I believe that we can improve the performance of some of these horses and therefore improve their welfare as well. I routinely use the ridden horse pain ethogram at pre-purchase examinations as an additional tool in my work as a detective to determine whether or not the horse is suitable for purchase for the purposes for which it is required. I think it is useful when assessing saddle fit, because saddle fit, an ill-fitting saddle, we know can contribute to pain and can make the ridden horse pain ethogram score be increased. I also use the ridden horse pain ethogram when I'm assessing the responses to nerve blocks in a lame horse. If I think I've abolished the lameness, but the ridden horse pain ethogram score remains at 8 or more, I know I must have missed something contributing to pain overall, and I have to investigate further. So to me, it's a hugely valuable tool. So my take-home messages from this part of the presentation are, even if a horse appears non-lame in hand, it may be lame when ridden, and this may be manifest by its behavior. Its behavior is an indicator that something is not right. And just because a horse can jump well doesn't mean that it's necessarily clinically normal. If it's not performing satisfactorily on the flat, that generally reflects the presence of a problem. I believe that problems which have historically been labelled as training related, rider related, or behavioural, or that is just how the horse has always gone, are usually pain induced. So, as we see in the images on the bottom, resistances to go forward, spookiness and tension, tail swishing, head tilt, are all potentially signs of underlying discomfort. A difficult horse may show one behavioural sign, such as rearing. But most so-called naughty horses show many behavioural signs consistent with the presence of underlying pain. So this grey horse is spooky. It swishes its tail, it's put its head, front of its head in front of the vertical position or behind the vertical position, or it rears and opens its mouth, shows an intense stare, exposure of the sclera, all signs in combination that reflects the presence of underlying musculoskeletal pain. I strongly believe that education of all involved in the equine industry is needed to recognise that these behaviours are not normal behaviours for horses. They reflect underlying musculoskeletal pain. And if we recognise this and investigated these horses, their performance could be improved. They would be more of a pleasure to ride, and importantly, the horse's welfare could also be improved. The next phase of my talk is to describe the influence of rider size and equine performance, a particularly emotive issue. As a basic fundamental principle, I believe that for optimal weight and force distribution, the rider should sit in the middle of the saddle to enable them to be in balance with the horse and as close to the horse's centre of gravity as possible. We performed a pilot study which assessed the influence of rider size on horse performance. We had 4 riders of similar ability, but differing in size, who each rode 6 non-lame horses in a crossover design in a randomized order. So we had a lightweight rider whose body weight was between 10 and 12% of the horse's body weight, a moderate weight rider whose body weight was more than 12 and up to 15% of the horse's body weight, a heavy rider who was more than 15 and up to 18% of the horse's body weight, and a very heavy rider who was more than 20% of the horse's body weight. And for each test, the riders rode a purpose-designed dressage test of 30 minutes duration, involving simple walk, trot, and canter, and transitions. We had reasons for premature abandonment of the test, and these were either the development of transient lameness of grade 2 out of 8, or the demonstration of 10 or more of the behavioral markers of the ridden horse pain ethogram. And all the tests for the heavy and the very heavy riders were abandoned, the majority because of transient lameness or the demonstration of 10 or more behavioral markers. The lameness was transient. These horses were assessed in trotting in hand within 30 to 40 minutes of completion of the ridden exercise, and they appeared non-lame at that time and were subsequently ridden either by the light or the moderate riders again and showed no evidence of lameness. The ridden horse pain ethogram was applied retrospectively to video recordings of the trot phases of the test. And we found that the ridden horse pain ethograms scores were positively correlated with rider weight. So there were a higher number of behaviors shown for the heavier riders compared with the lighter riders. So in this graph, we can see the total score of the ridden horse pain ethogram on the vertical axis, and the 4 riders, the lightweight, moderate, heavy, and very heavy, on the horizontal axis. And we can see that the scores are higher for the for the heavy and very heavy riders compared with the lighter weight riders. But note that it was only for the heavy rider that the score ever exceeded a threshold of 8. We determined that this failure to complete the test, either due to transient lameness or the display of 10 or more behaviors of the ridden horse pain ethogram, was an influence of body weight or size rather than the body mass index. The body mass index is a proportion of the height of the rider's weight divided by the height squared. Overweight is defined as being between 25 and 29.9. And we can see that our moderate weight rider had a body mass index of 28. So she was classified as overweight. So both the moderate and the heavy riders were overweight. The very heavy rider was obese. However, when we compare the results for the moderate and the heavy riders, all the tests were abandoned for the heavy rider, but only 1 of 12 tests was abandoned for the rider of moderate weight. I think it is critical to think about this study, not only with respect to weight, but also rider size. because the normal rider of horse 2 was a very similar body weight, 92 kilograms, compared with our heavy rider, who was 91 kilograms. However, the normal rider of horse 2, depicted in the image on the left, was considerably shorter, being only 157 centimeters, compared with rider H, who was 185.5 centimeters. The horses were ridden in their normal saddles, mimicking, for example, what happens when an adult rider warms up a pony in preparation for a show class. As a result of this, the heavy rider in the horse's saddle for horse 2 finished up sitting on the back of the saddle rather than in the middle of the saddle. The normal rider for horse 2 was able to sit in the middle of the saddle, and the horse showed no evidence of discomfort or lameness when ridden by her. So I believe that there is a huge influence of rider height on their potential position in the saddle, which alters their weight distribution and their center of gravity, and their center of gravity relative to the horse's center of gravity. So the heavy rider has to adapt their posture by anteriorly tipping the pelvis and having a forward orientation of their torso in order to remain in balance with the horse. So factors which influence rider position are their height, both their limb length and their trunk length, their seat size, and the design, fit, and balance of the saddle, and the fit of the saddle, not only for the horse, but also for the rider. We performed a pilot study which comprised 34 horse-rider combinations, and a variety of different assessors were asked to determine whether or not the rider was too big for the saddle. And of these 34 horse-rider combinations, the seat of the rider was too large for the saddle in 41% of horses, as depicted in this picture. We performed a study of 150 horse-rider combinations. And I should comment here that I'm referring to a number of different studies, and all of these studies will be available, or the citations of these studies will be available to you via the World Horse Welfare website. The seat of the rider was too large for the saddle in 45% of these 150 horses. 57% of the riders sat on the back third of the saddle rather than in the middle of the saddle. The potential reasons for this were either the saddle was too small relative either to the rider's leg length or to the size of their seat, or the saddle was the wrong shape for the rider, or the stirrup bars were in an inappropriate position for that rider's size, or the rider had an inherently poor position, or obviously it could be a combination of factors. The effect of where in the saddle the rider is sitting is potentially compounded if the rider is out of balance with the horse, so is not in complete synchrony with the movement of the horse. And of our 150 horse rider combinations, 54% of the riders were deemed to be out of balance by a British Horse Society instructor. The saddle seat tipped backwards in 21% of the saddles, and this is inclined to place the rider in a chair seat position, making it very difficult for them to maintain balance with the horse. The saddle moved excessively during ridden exercise, either bouncing up and down, that is dorsoventral movement, in 53% of the horses, or oscillating abnormally from side to side, seen in 58% of horses, or the saddle persistently slipping to one side, as we see in the image on the right, when the saddle is slipping to the left side. This was observed in 45% of the horses. We have to bear in mind that force equals mass, i.e. the weight of the rider, times acceleration. So the weight of the rider has a direct effect on the forces exerted on the horse's back via the saddle. And this is why I believe that the balance of the rider, the alignment of their shoulder, hip, and heel, and their ability to sit straight are of vital importance. And this is particularly important with respect to alignment of the rider's mass and the horse's center of gravity. So if the rider is very tall, as we see in the example here, relative to the size of the saddle, this results in the rider sitting on the back of the saddle and their shoulder, hip, and heel not being in alignment, making it more difficult for them to adjust their body weight to be aligned with the horse's center of gravity. So what are the consequences of the rider sitting on the caudal half of the saddle? We evaluated this by objective measurement of the forces underneath the saddle with the use of a pliance pressure mat. And here we have the results of the pressure according to the area under the saddle. The black squares represent the very heavy rider, the white squares represent the heavy rider, the black circles relate to the moderate weight rider, and the white circles represent the lightweight rider. First of all, we looked at the left-right symmetry of pressures at both walk and trot, and these are highlighted by the yellow boxes. And we can see that the average left-right pressures are pretty symmetrical for all the riders. We then look at the pressure distribution on the front half of the saddle versus the back half of the saddle. And we can see for the very heavy rider that there are substantially higher forces under the back of the saddle compared with the front of the saddle at the walk. There are slightly higher pressures underneath the back of the saddle compared with the front of the saddle for the other riders, but these are not statistically significantly different. When we look at the trot on the right-hand side and compare the forces under the front half of the saddle and the back half of the saddle, we see at the trot, the forces under the front half of the saddle are significantly higher compared with the back half of the saddle for the lightweight, moderate, and heavy riders, whereas for the very heavy rider, the pressure distribution under the front and the back of the saddle remains fairly similar. So what consequences are there for this? In our study of 148 horses, which were assessed both in hand and ridden, we found that there was a positive association between riders sitting on the caudal 1/3 of the saddle and the ridden horse pain ethogram score. And I think this has to be borne in mind. It's very important that weight distribution is through the central part of the saddle, not through the back third of the saddle. There are consequences for back muscle function with respect to how the weight is distributed. We have previously shown that there are measurable increases in the width of the horse's back during ridden exercise. So if we use a flexible curved ruler to measure the width of the horse's back at 3 predetermined anatomical locations, the 8th, 13th, and 18th thoracic vertebrae, and we compare those dimensions at 3 and 15 centimeters below the top of the horse's back, we have shown that horses which are working correctly on the bit in a correctly fitting saddle show an increase in those back dimensions during that 30-minute work period. In our rider weight study, we demonstrated that if a rider whose body weight was at least 16% of the horse's body weight sat on the back of the saddle rather than the middle, there was actually a reduction in the thoracic dimensions during a 30 minutes work period. And this is demonstrated by these figures. For both the light and the moderate weight riders, we saw increases in back dimensions of 1.2 centimeters and 0.4 centimeters respectively, whereas for the heavy and very heavy riders, we saw reductions of back dimensions of -1 and -0.7 centimeters respectively. And these differences were statistically significantly different. Now you will see that with a very heavy rider, the back dimension reductions were less than for the heavy rider. And that was probably because the time to abandonment of the tests for the very heavy rider were much earlier on in the test, 8 minutes versus 16 minutes for the heavy rider. We believe that this failure for the back muscles to expand during ridden exercise has potential deleterious consequences for long-term development of the muscles and may actually result in atrophy or shrinkage of the long back muscle, the longissimus dorsi muscle in the thoracic region, and as a consequence of that, altered function of the thoracolumbo-sacral region. Now, this study clearly had some limitations because the effect of rider size is a multifactorial issue. We have to consider the horse, its height, weight, body condition score, conformation, fitness, and soundness. The rider, not only their weight, but their fitness, their skill, their ability to ride symmetrically, their balance, their ability to control their postures, and pre-existing health issues. The type of work that the horse does, its intensity, the duration of the work, the footing of the surface, and the terrain over which the horse is being worked. And also the saddle, the total load-bearing area, the fit and suitability for both the horse and the rider. But I believe that there are important take-home messages. These studies do not mean that larger riders should not ride, but they suggest that if large riders do so, they should ride a horse of appropriate size and fitness with a saddle that is correctly fitted for both the horse and the rider. With some riders, it may be possible to alter the rider's position by using a saddle which is better suited to their size and which also fits the horse. But we have to bear in mind that the saddle tree should not extend beyond the 18th thoracic vertebra, and therefore, with some horse-rider combinations, it may be impossible to have a saddle which fits both the horse and the rider. We need to ask the question, does the combination look right? And if the answer is no, then that's probably the correct answer. I believe that horses are trying to communicate with us. We just have to learn how to listen to the horses. We need to learn how to observe more closely and understand that behavioral abnormalities usually reflect pain. We have a responsibility of care to the horses which we ride. I would like to conclude by acknowledging the many bodies that have provided financial support to the rider weight study, and also World Horse Welfare, who have supported my group financially for most of the studies that I've described to you. I also wish to thank all the owners who provided horses for the studies and all the riders as well, and the professional colleagues and collaborators. This is not a job that can be done by a single person.